What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 788. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. And joining me on the line all the way from Las Vegas, Nevada, it's Paul Cheon. Paul, is it sunny down there? Because it's sunny up here.
Well, it's usually sunny up here. It's in Vegas. It doesn't rain here, but I have been enjoying the weather here more than Seattle, at least in the wintertime. Usually Seattle is kind of wet and gloomy for half the year, but in the wintertime it's kind of at its worst. And right now we can go for nice walks and we can do stuff on the weekend. So I've been enjoying it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm jealous. It's been really nice here. It's cold, but the sun's been out for 4 or 5 days straight. So I don't know. I can't tell how I feel about it, Paul, because I know it's not going to stay, right? And so, don't tease me. Like, I don't want to get my brain moving, thinking that it's April or whatever. And I'm like, hey, we're right around the corner. It's like, nah, dude, you still got 3 months of this stuff. But
you know what's going to remind us of the winter? When we go to Chicago in a couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Then we'll get actual winter.
Right. Yeah,
I grew up here and, the overall temperatures are pretty mild compared to most places. I just didn't know that. I thought that the summers were hot and the winters were cold. And then I started traveling and I was like, you go to Minnesota in the winter, you find out what cold is, and like when I was young, I went on a long trip to Africa and it was like, oh, this is what hot is, like, humid and heat every day. And even at night, it stays that way. And when I came home, I had a newfound appreciation for mild weather that I didn't know I had my whole life. So, Paul, we've got the set review, should be good to go for next week. But I thought we would do a level up episode as we have kind of an extra week here. And we haven't got to do one with you yet. So we're going to do a level up where we're going to talk kind of a theory crafting style level up, where I'm going to put a bunch of questions out to Paul and him and I will answer them together and use it as a discussion topic about how he/you should approach a limited format now. Because we talk a lot about contrasting, limited a few years ago to now, because it helps people understand that, hey, the assumptions you had are no longer valid, or at least they're being questioned. And then it's also fun to talk about nostalgic stuff like, with TBS and going back in time and all that too, to see how different things are. But it did get me thinking that, as a little bit of a reset, what if I, were to pose questions to Paul and to our audience and answer them with Paul, about a mysterious set that's upcoming. Let's say there's a 2-color set coming out in the summer. And that's all you really know. It's an expert level set. It's a normal release, nothing special. What are your assumptions going into that? And how do you approach that format as kind of a baseline? Of course, we know that once the cards actually start coming out, we'll start adjusting our baselines and adapting to the actual format. But, the assumptions that you have today may not match the ones that our listeners have because of, bias looking backwards or maybe just missing the mark there. So that's what we're going to talk about on the show today. Before we do, we want to say thank you to everybody who supports us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. We also want to say thank you to Ultimate Guard. If you need deck boxes, sleeves, long boxes, backpacks, any ways to protect your cards, binders, right? You have these collections of cards, particularly if you're a collector or if you like to keep up on like constructed formats or whatever, or if you just have your decks, like the decks that you play, or even, for limited players, like I always bring my own stuff. If I go to a live draft, I have a deck box, I have sleeves in it, I bring my own dice. Like I like to have my own stuff so that I even bring my own lands just because I like to play with certain ones. And that way, I don't have to go digging around through the land box or bumming sleeves off people. Like I have everything the way I like it. And you're going to need a deck box. You're going to need sleeves. Ultimate Guard's the place to go for that. They make the best stuff in the business. I mean, if you ever get a chance to just hold some of their products in your hand, you're going to go, whoa, like these are very premium products. They really put a lot of thought into the design of these things. And we can't recommend them highly enough. If you want to check out their products, it's ultimateguard.com. And if you want to pick something up, you can get it from your favorite online retailer or your favorite local game store. One perk of being a Patreon supporter of the show is that you get to ask questions in our Patreon question of the week thread. And this one comes from Douglas, who says, Patreon announced some changes due to Apple squeezing them in a pretty anti-competitive way. From first read, it looks bad for you guys, given the way you handle Patreon subs. And then Douglas says, if you move to Substack, I'll follow. Thank you, Douglas. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. We haven't made that change, and I'm still kind of figuring out exactly the implications of it. But it does look like more or less Patreon has two different models that the creators can choose. They can either choose a per creation model where you can put up as many posts as you want, but you can flag certain posts as here's the thing that I do. For example, a podcast for us, or if you make a song, or if you put up a video, and you can say, okay, here's my new release as, the video. And then your supporters get to pick how much they want to pay per one of those. So like we usually put up 4 episodes a month, depending, sometimes it's 5, but it's usually 4 a month. And so our pricing is based on per episode. And then you can decide how many you want to do. And then that, to me, is the best way to do it for us. Well, it's not. So this is kind of interesting. It's actually not the best way for the creator, but I still prefer it. The reasons that I like it are that it's a natural incentive structure that makes sense, right? If we don't put out the show, we don't get anything. I like that. It's like, hey, get up, let's go. Like you got to put up the show. And, so that adds as an extra layer of motivation or something like that. And it just means that the incentives are aligned. People are getting exactly what they want to get, when they supported us. And so I like that. And then also it makes it easier to cap. Basically, we want and have always had our Patreon set that you can do whatever you want. Like, you can pick any tier, you can cap it at any level. Like, for example, if you're like a $5 supporter and we put out, 4 shows a month, but you don't want to do that much, you can just say, I'm going to limit it at 2 times per month, or 1 time, or 3. You can do whatever you want. And that's how we want it. The Patreon is always meant to be open and transparent, and you can leave whenever you want. You can come back whenever you want. We never want anybody to feel any type of pressure about supporting us on there. We totally recognize that, your support via Patreon is something that is fully voluntary, and it's for people that it's no problem. Like, we'd never want anybody, who is having to make any tough financial decision to consider supporting us. Like, we're way down on the list of that. And I've always felt that this model is the one that reflects that the best. It's also the reason, by the way, that I chose this model for the Watch YouTube channel, for my wristwatch one. I have the same model there too, and it's for the same reasons. But I have got some emails from Patreon saying basically that it sounds a little weird, but the way that Apple, like, in order for Apple to accept payment on behalf of Patreon, they go through Apple Pay. And so this is for people that want to sign up in the app to do the thing via Apple Pay, is that they don't support, apparently Apple doesn't support a per creation type model. They only do the other option, which is
subscription model, the monthly.
The monthly,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And the monthly is in many ways the superior model, because the benefits of it are that as the supporter exactly what you're going to give. There's no months where it's like, well, we only put out 3 shows, or this month we put out 5. Yeah. And so that's a good thing. And then as a creator, it is actually better for the creator because it's consistent. And what I've heard from Patreon, and it does make sense to me. I'm just kind of hardcore about this stuff because I take it seriously when somebody, wants to support us in that way, that I really, really want to make sure that they're getting, great stuff and we're consistent about it. But there is another argument that does make sense, which is that when Patreon has asked Patreon supporters how they would feel, like, let's say Paul and I had like a personal emergencies or something, and we just couldn't do the show for a month. And then we picked it back up again. And they asked the patron supporters, like, well, how would you want that to be handled? They always answer, no, I still want to pay them for the month. Like, it's okay. Like, we get it. People have stuff coming up in their life, and, I'm supporting them because I want to support them. It's not about some transactional thing, right? So I totally get that part as well. But it does look like Patreon they have already strongly suggested that we move over to monthly. Basically, they were just saying like, you could lose a lot because this one revenue thing from Apple is basically going to be shut down this year at some point. And so they're kind of urging us to get out ahead of it. The vibe I also got was that they are kind of going to use this to move everything over to the monthly model. I don't think that they said that explicitly, but that was kind of the implication, was like, and even if you don't move over right away, you're probably just going to have to anyway. So we will probably have to restructure that. I am not looking forward to it. I hate stuff like that, the administrative side of it. But it's probably a good time to refresh that anyway. So if you are a Patreon supporter of us, that will be communicated to you over there. But long answer for Douglas, but I wanted to use it as an opportunity to talk about it because I have been getting those emails from Patreon, and that probably is coming down the line. I don't think it's a huge deal. Like, it kind of doesn't matter that much. It's a little bit more to the principle of it for me.
Right.
But
yeah, I mean, you can probably just kind of restructure it where it's just very close to what you have right now, but it's still just, I get, you've been using this model for many, many years now. And then just now this is a big change. So yeah, I totally get it. Yeah. I guess I didn't get this email because mine is on a monthly schedule.
You're already on monthly.
Yeah, I'm on monthly, so I don't have to make that decision. But it was kind of arbitrary. I just didn't even really think about it. And it just made sense for me just because I'm not going to charge per every video. I do daily videos. So charging per video that would just not make a lot of sense. So
yeah. And both of the things I do, like this show is weekly, so it's about 4 a month. And then for the Watch channel, I try to get out 2 per month. But it is motivational. I would prefer to keep this model, but like you said, they have people that will help us kind of take a tier, and they can actually tell us what like the average payout from that tier was per person. And then we can say, okay, we'll make it that many dollars basically. Right. And so it all kind of comes out in the wash. Like, it'll end up being the same thing more or less, but anyway, so that'll be coming down the line. Okay. So let's get into this, Paul. So the framing that I'd like to use for this level up episode is what I described before, which is that I want you to put yourself in the shoes of you, or maybe somebody who's
easy enough.
Yeah, that part's easy, which is Paul, has at least 2 strong needs to know what's going on in limited, right? He has to make his videos. So if he doesn't know what's going on in limited, that's going to severely impact the quality of his videos. And, to the point that like people wouldn't watch, like people know, they know if you know what's up or not. And then the other one is, commentating at the booth. And then sometimes you're qualified for big events as well. And that adds to it. So you have a very, very strong incentive to know what's going on at any given time in limited. So if I came to you and said, hey, Paul, have you heard about the set that's coming out in summer? We don't know anything about it. The only thing that they've said is that it's just normal 2-color set. There's nothing weird going on with them trying to push multicolor beyond that. And so that's the lens I want you to look at this through, because I'm curious, what are your assumptions? And I want you to kind of take stock today about how you approach these things for yourself, because, we sort of arrive to these conclusions, but like, I don't know when. You know what I mean? Like, unless we kind of stop and say, do you believe this or that? It's kind of like, oh, actually, I believe this. I do believe this. And, we'll get into some of the details. Where I wanted to start, though, was on a big picture point that goes all the way back actually to the 4th episode of this podcast, where me and Ryan talked
That's
about.
A long time ago.
It was in like 2009 or something.
Okay.
You can listen to it, by the way, on lrcast.com. It's still there. It's called Breaking Bread. And this is, by the way, when I had Ryan to come up with amazingly clever names for each of the episodes. And Anyway, and bread, for people that don't know, is an acronym that was really heavily used back then. And I assume it is still thrown around on, Reddit or somewhere these days, but you don't hear it as often. And it was really bad in many ways. It was meant to provide a very base skeleton for a brand new drafter on what order to pick what types of cards. And the problems with it are that it's too blunt of a tool for something as complicated as draft. It really wears out very quickly, or it's obvious, either one. And then the other problem is that the first three letters are kind of insightful and interesting, and then nobody knows what the last two are supposed to mean. It's a fundamentally bad acronym because nobody can ever agree on what the words actually stand for. So the first three are bombs, removal, and evasion. And these are, ideas that people would put out that, you should take bombs. And then the next most important thing was removal. And then the next most important things were creatures with evasion.
Okay.
Which is a bizarre thing, to focus on these days. And then the last two, would stand for all different, types of stuff, dregs, and I don't. Do you remember what people would say about the A and the D?
I have no clue. I honestly didn't even know. Like, I was trying to figure it out myself.
Yeah, it changed all the time.
Yeah, and look, bombs and removal, I think, still hold true to this day. I think those are obviously important things. I think somewhere along the lines, some of those letters need to be adjusted. Where I think one of the most important things when you draft a deck is your mana curve, and just making sure that you have a good one. And if you do, then you will almost always have a chance. And people who tend to ignore mana curve or play too many colors, stuff like that, they're just going to get far more free losses, and you're going to get a lot more free wins in those matchups. And if maybe we come up with something new at some point, I am not clever enough to do that on the spot. But I do think that is also a really, really big thing, a really, really important thing that you need to consider now, definitely more than 15 years ago when maybe bread was a little more relevant.
Right. I just looked it up about what AI thinks bread stands for. And it is bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and dirt.
Dirt. All right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
I guess aggro could be curve.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Like, if it's that interpretable, right, it's not a great acronym. Another one from MTG Wiki is bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and duds.
Okay. Yeah, but the thing is like that last letter is not even necessary, right? Just because you don't want to ever play anything in D then, if that's the case. So you're more, I think just the three big things is just bombs, greater sign, and then some combination of removal and curve. But it's not clear to me even what takes priority there in modern Magic, right?
Yeah.
It just there are formats where removal just doesn't, like a good removal spell is just not going to be better than a good 2-drop. And so there are instances where that's more important, especially when you tell me it's a 2-color set. Oftentimes it's a little more straightforward and you want to just be playing to the themes of your deck. And oftentimes those usually end up being faster sets, where if it's a faster set, then you're less likely to want to branch into a third color because there's always a tax on your mana and what you pick to make a 3-color deck viable. So I think it's kind of like bombs are still bombs. Bombs are still great. They're always going to be great because they're always going to be either massively undercosted for the stats that you get, or they're going to have a huge impact on the game when you cast them. If it's a 5 or 6 mana spell, it's going to come into play, get you some tokens, kill some creatures, or draw you some cards. And all of those things are highly advantageous things that you want. So bombs are always going to be the top dog. But then the second thing, I don't even know if removal is the case, unless it's a cheap removal spell, right? If you're just like, if it's a shock, yeah, that's going to be perfect. I'm going to always want to take shock, and I'm going to always take it highly if it's a stab, burst, lightning, whatever. But then, yeah, the evasion part of it now, I think you can just completely ignore. I just don't even care if something, like, if it has flying, it's good. But I am, if it's a 3-mana 2/2 flyer versus a 3-mana 3/3, I'm taking that 3/3 all day, every day. If it's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer and a 3-mana 3/3 with marginal upside, I will often take the 3-mana 3/3. It's just a lot more about stats now and playing to the board, and evasion, I think, is just a lot less important.
Yeah, it's funny. You were talking about the acronym we needed to come up with. We actually did. Luis and I did. I should say Luis did. He came up with keto.
Of course he did.
And of course he like top downed it where like he decided it was going to be keto and then like fit all this like,
of course
it was like kills, like I don't remember, but that was a few years ago he did that.
Nice.
But yeah, it's interesting because bombs definitely still, that part holds steady. It was also always the most obvious though, right? Like nobody needed help with that part. Nobody was ever like, oh, I'm going to take this random common over, some flashy, cool rare that I want to pick and I want in my collection and I want to attack with and do that stuff anyway. That was never part of the issue. The only enlightening thing I think for brand new players was the removal portion. But I would say that has definitely changed. It is not strictly the next thing. There have been numerous sets over the past few years. And I would expect this to at least somewhat carry forward where removal in a given color were not the best common.
Yeah.
Right. It was about the threats. It's particularly when the sets, when they had that stretch for 1.5, almost 2 years where they were very fast and the 1-drops were quite good, the removal plummeted in value. You just didn't, if it cost 4 mana and even if it was a hard removal spell, you're like, nah, just take the threat. Right. And this is a common pattern that you see in Magic. When the threats outpace the answers just plummet in value. And one of the easy ways to, or an easy framework to see this under, it works for Constructed as well, is like a mana use scenario, right? If your removal spell costs 2 more mana than the threat you're going to cast, that you're going to kill, that is an absolute disaster. It's unacceptable, and you will 100% see the relative value of that removal go down. If it costs 1 more than the creature that you're killing, that's bad. Yep. Like that's bad. Like you're behind. Like calling it a disaster is probably hyperbole, but it's bad. Like that is not an exchange that you can afford to make more than maybe once in a game without it really starting to impact your win rate. If the removal spell costs the same as the threat that you're killing, you'll take it. It's not great, but you'll take it. Because a lot of times these creatures have ETB abilities, or maybe they got to attack you a couple of times before you actually find the removal spell, something like that. In the scenario where the removal costs anything less than what the creature costs, it's great, right? Like that is where you want to be. And that is one of the ways that you can jump ahead in a game of Magic win rate wise. And that's why, Paul, right? That's why you said like, hey, if it's cheap, if it's a shock or something that I can kill a 2 or sometimes 3 mana creature for just 1, that's how you make your money.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically a good rule of thumb, just going into any set, if it's a removal spell that costs 2 mana or less, it will almost always be good to premium level removal spell in your deck in any format, just because curve is so important. Let's say you don't even know if it's going to be fast or slow, but just look, if there's a shock, it's almost always going to be good. They're not going to make a limited set anymore where shock is a bad card, right? It's just going to be so important to play to the board. But when you get to 3 and above, then that's where things start getting interesting. I think Murders at Karlov Manor was one of the best examples of this from the previous year, where that was a format that was aggressive. Red-white was one of the best things you could be doing in the format. And also it encouraged you to go wide. There were several cards that made a token when it came into play. And let's say your opponent plays an Insight Source on turn 3, which is a 3-mana 1/1 that enters the battlefield and makes a 2/2 token. What are you going to do? You're going to murder the 2/2 token? Right. They still have a 1/1 thing left over. So interesting enough, Murder went from something that was considered a premium common, that was an uncommon in some sets, to barely an average level black removal spell in that format, just because of how fast it was and the fact that you were supposed to go wide. Also, black was just not a great color in that set in general, but that's how you can get a card like Murder, which has historically been a premium level removal spell. And depending on the context of the format, it can be good to something that you're just not going to take very highly, and you're just going to take, there have been sets where you're like shock versus murder. Yeah, obviously murder. Murder kills everything. It's everything you want. Now, in this new world, I'm taking shock almost every time in the dark.
Right, just until you can feel like you have a better feel or there's something. Right. But it's gone from murder being a hard lock that doesn't need to prove itself to being like, I don't know, right? Yeah. You would never be surprised if I told you, hey, murder's really good, right? You'd be like, yeah, okay, black probably supports it properly or whatever. But if I came to you and said, yeah, murder's fine. Like you can, if you take one, it's okay, but like take it sixth, like don't take it third. You would not gasp at that at all. And that's a really important thing to remember, is that when the threats are either just better or cheaper than the removal, those adjustments need to be made. And I would say that, going into a blind format, I would be more likely to assume that the threats are better than the removal in most scenarios than not. That's not across the board. You can definitely find examples where that's not the case, and removal definitely still plays a key part in limited. But I would say it is reduced, and going into a format, I would be kind of in the middle. I would be like, unless it costs 1 or 2 mana, like you said, Paul, and that I feel like I can profitably kill things that cost more, routinely, I'd be like, there's this good threat here. I'm just going to take that. Because the truth is that threats beat answers, period. If you look at like how constructed formats evolve over time, they always start off where like you can play control decks, or you can, do these things, and then they devolve, is one way to put it, or evolve, depending on how you see it, into things where trying to have answers becomes futile. Right? Like if you're trying to do counter spells and then the person's playing some super low to the ground aggro deck, it doesn't work. If you try to pack removal and combo is a viable thing in that format, you don't want to have your removal spells against the deck with no creatures. And people just go, never mind, I can't tailor any type of control strategy. So what ends up happening? Threats rule the day. The threats outpace the answers. And that can happen in limited too.
Yeah, I feel like basically if you're ever going to look to play a removal spell that costs 4 mana, if it doesn't give you anything outside of just killing the creature, it's not going to be that great. But if it gives you something, a token, obviously that's insane, like a 1/1, or if it gives you a treasure or gives you a food or lets you scry, like if it gives you something on top of the actual ability to kill a creature, then the card gets much, much better. Bake into a pie. Great example of this, right? 4 mana, kill a creature. That's fine, but not insane. But the fact that you get that food token is huge and kind of puts that over the top. Same thing, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Consuming Ashes, right? It's a card that kills something, but then if you kill something small, you get to scry, which adds a lot more value to that type of removal effect.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that, there's almost like an emotional component to it where prior, if I were to get a piece of removal along that way, I would feel powerful. Like I'm getting away with something. Like this just took me a big step towards, potentially winning my games. Now, when I pick up removal of that type, it's my insurance policy. It's like, I need to have something. Like I can't not, but I don't feel like I just took a big step towards winning my draft. I just feel like I checked a box.
Yeah. I mean, and especially when you talk about sorcery speed removal, that's expensive. I mean, those are just cards you just don't take. You just take it late and just go, okay, I have no removal. I will take this 5 mana kill anything card because I absolutely have to, but I'm not going to be super happy about it. I don't even care what kind of bonus benefits it gets you. If it's a sorcery speed removal spell that costs you 4 or 5 mana, that's just not something that you actively want to take very highly. And a lot of people still probably make that mistake, especially when they go into a set. They're just like, 4 mana kill anything, sorcery speed. That's got to be good, right? It's like, no, probably just take the 2-drop with upside that looks like it does something, right? Or this 3 mana creature that looks like it could be a build around. That's more often than not going to be something that you want way, way more than just random 4 mana sorcery speed removal spell.
Yeah, given that, talking about creatures, the biggest change that we've had to adapt to big picture was that the creatures have all gotten better across the board. It's not even remotely close if you try to compare them. If you go back in like 2 or 3 year chunks, go back 3 years, go back another 3, go back another 3, you'll just see this curve of the creatures, power creeping upwards. But on top of it, I would say the relative average power level of the creatures is higher as well, meaning that even if you compare them only to each other, there's more good creatures in a set than there used to be. And I think that same curve goes back in time. If you go back really far, you'll find horrendously unplayable garbage, 5 mana 1/1 with downside that could do something one day, that kind of stuff where it's like not even on the radar. But if you go kind of in the middle between the old days and now, you'll find a mix of like vanilla or understated, we'll call them, creatures, and then okay stuff. But if you look now, the cards, let me bring up, let's just do a quick, we'll go to Duskmorn, let's say, and I'll bring up the black commons. So the worst black common by a mile is Cackling Slasher. And this is a 4 mana 3/3 death touch that enters with a +1/+1 counter on it if a creature died this turn. That's the worst, literally the worst creature there, right? A subpar creature is Balemark Leech, 1 and a black 2/2 with Eerie, Eerie, they lose a life, right?
Yeah.
Totally fine, right? Appendage Amalgam, 2 and a black 3/2 flash enchantment creature, and whenever it attacks you, surveil 1. That's well below the bar for that set.
Right.
So, and all of these are totally acceptable Magic cards. They're only bad relative to the other cards, which is all that matters for us. But, it's worth noting that like you can put any of those cards in your deck and they will attack, block, sometimes give you a bonus and do things. Given that relatively flat power level of these creatures, what are the differentiators now? Like what are how do you actually decide between, again, a card like Innocuous Rat, the one that dies in Manifest Dread, versus, an Appendage Amalgam, which looks fine. I mean, it's got flash, it's 3 power, it's an enchantment, but yet one of those is deemed unplayable and the other one is, usually basically always makes the cut.
Yeah. So there's a few things. I think one of the biggest things is just mana cost. Just if it's cheap, it has a higher chance of being a decent card. Now, Balemark Leech withstanding. And then also, if it's for creatures at least, if they have a come into play effect or a death trigger at a reasonable cost, they will almost always be solid, right? Just, for example, in Foundations, both Helpful Hunter and Burglar Rat, you look at both of those and they're just like, okay, they're just 2 mana 1/1s, but they come into play and do something. And effects like that tend to just give you, you just know that you're going to get something out of that deal. Whereas the Appendage Amalgam, its body is a little bit weak and you still need to attack to actually get something out of it. The Cackling Slasher, it's a conditional effect. Like a 4 mana 3/3 death touch creature is fine. But let's say you just shaved the mana off of that thing and made it a 2/2. Be way, way stronger, right? So just you really have to consider mana curve a lot. And then also, if you're going with the context of just going into a set blind, if it's a common and it costs 5 mana and it doesn't have a good come into play effect, it's just going to be bad. A 5 mana 5/5 Trampler is just not going to be very good. It's just not something that you're going to want in most sets. So oftentimes just look at, if it's close, especially because we're trying to take this into the lens of somebody drafting a new set for the first time. If it's close, just take the cheaper card. And if it's close between a creature and a removal spell, I would lean towards just taking the creature. That's cheaper. And then just try to draft around that. And oftentimes you can't go too wrong with it. You might have to make an adjustment later. But I think you can be more incorrect going the other way and just end up with kind of a deck that just can't necessarily handle the speed of the format. Because no format's going to be super slow anymore. right? That's just not how they do Magic sets. I mean, we have slower sets, but you're still going to need to have a good curve.
So I can't hope. You're saying,
yeah, you can't hope to just.
I was still hoping until you said that.
Foundations, you were able to kind of pull it off there, but Foundations had a certain goal, and that goal is just not going to be matched, I think, in any main set release for the most part.
And it wasn't slow; it was just normal speed and felt slow.
Sure.
Because of these stupid.
Look, you can play Think Twice. Can you imagine trying to play Think Twice in I don't know.
None of the sets that have come out outside of the one that it was in. Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah, no.
So, you're just not going to be able to pull that off. But to see that's the thing, right? Going into Foundations, we might have just assumed that Think Twice is just not something that you can really pull off in any limited set, but we would have been wrong potentially, right? Just because we'd be like, okay, well, you just can't spend 5 mana to draw 2 cards. That's just crazy. But turns out in that set you could. But I would say going in the dark, don't anticipate or expect Think Twice to be a good card.
Man, you just really killed my vibe, Paul. Like,
I love Think Twice.
All I ever want is to play in sets where Think Twice is a good card and Think Twice exists. I think I've decided that Think Twice is my favorite card draw spell all time.
It's a good one. I mean, it is all time.
Yeah.
Isn't Deduce better?
What does it do?
It's 1 in a blue, draw a card, you investigate.
Oh, Deduce. No. No way.
Oh.
No way. And by the way, I didn't say best. I said favorite. Like,
oh, okay. You know what? That's
I can
fair.
think of a few that are better.
Okay. You know what my favorite common card draw card is?
What?
Mole Drifter.
Oh my God. That's rude, dude. Yeah, I didn't know I could take a creature. Now you got me questioning my decisions. I just thought of something that's interesting when you were talking about the 5-drop thing. And we had talked about the 1-drop thing earlier. And I think I've got at least somewhat of a structure around why. And it goes to the removal that we were talking about before, because, the mana system in Magic's like one of the best things about it, but it's also one of the least flexible, right? There's no legal half of a mana. There's no, you can't do something that's between 1 mana and 2 mana. It's either 1 mana or 2 mana. And it seems to me that they realized at some point, that these 1 mana creatures just weren't up to par. They were basically just throwaway designs. But 1 mana is like a really important point of the game. And it feels a little wasted to just have us all just play a land and say go every single time. So, they started making these cards more viable. And what they really did, though, is they made them comparable to 2-drops. Maybe not good 2-drops in most cases, but like playable 2-drops, that cost 1 mana. And it was like, okay, that's fine, right? Like, what could go wrong? And then if you shift your focus up to the 5 mana slot, you've got the creatures that you mentioned. On paper, they look fine. Right? 5 mana, 5/5 trample or something where you're like, hey, this is good. Like, what? Like, this is a real threat. I can get it at common. It only costs 5. Like, this thing counts. This thing matters. No ETB effect, but it's big and it hits hard and whatever. And the problem with these two end markers is of kind of the natural curve, for limited, is that the removal almost always has to fit inside of that. So most of the removal costs 2, 3, or 4. And the issue is that if you want to point any of that removal at the 1-drop, you're behind. And if you want to point any of that removal at the 5-drop, you're ahead.
Right.
So if you're a smart player, you're like, I'm going to play more of these 1-drops where there are no good answers, or the best case scenario answer is that they answer it with a 1-for-1 removal spell. And if I look at the 5s, I'm just going to avoid them, because no matter what, the best case scenario for me, if this creature were to die to a removal spell, the best case in most scenarios is that my opponent still spent 4 mana to kill it, maybe 5 if I'm lucky. But it is not possible in a removal against creature scenario in basically all of these things where I actually come out ahead if I play a 5 mana creature that doesn't give me anything when it ETBs.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just taking a look at, I think Foundations is a pretty good baseline to use, but I'm just looking at the 5-mana creatures here. Armosaur Guide, one of the worst creatures in the entire format. It barely does anything the turn that you play it, right? Even a card that looks playable, the Elfsworn Giant, right? That's a 5-mana 5/3. It's only okay
with reach
landfall. It's only okay if you treat it as a 6-drop and you play it on turn 6 and you make a token because it just dies right away. So the only chance you have as a 5-mana card to have some value is to probably affect the board in some way. Because even if you look at Icewind Elemental, which is a card that you look at, you're like, oh, this card's pretty sweet. It's a 5-mana 3/4 flyer and it loots. That also ended up being something that was an underperformer in the format because it just doesn't impact the board and the body isn't quite strong for when you pay 5 mana for something. The best 5-drop in Foundations was Gorehorn Raider. Because that's a 5-mana 4/4, but when it comes in, it helps you stabilize a little bit. It gets you that value immediately, and it ended up that's the only 5-drop that's cracked the top 20 in Foundations, and none of the other 5-drops come even close.
Totally. So think about that. When if there is a new mystery set coming, you think about the cards that cost 5 or more mana, and you match that up against the removal spells that they are likely to face. And you will realize why those cards are so difficult to make actually good. And so, to me, what this really puts and I want to put this as a question to you, Paul. What are the things that we need to see to put these type of cards, not just 5s, but really any creature these days that makes them special, that makes them a card that we'll see game in and game out over the set? Is it just ETB abilities? Is there more than that?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a big one. ETB abilities or an ability that you can cash in on and get some value out of almost immediately. The best creature in, again, using Foundations was Dazzling Angel. That's just on rate. A 3-mana 2/3 flyer is solid. Nothing crazy, but it's very solid. But then just the fact that you can gain a life every turn helps your race. That's exactly what the flying deck wants to do. But I'm just looking at the top 6 common creatures in Foundations. Number 2 is Helpful Hunter. Enters a battlefield, gives you value. Number 3, it's your boy, Big Fin Bouncer.
BFB.
Right? BFB. Enters the battlefield, gives you some value, gives you that tempo back. Number 4, Felidar Savior. Another great creature, 4-mana 2/3 lifelinker, enters a battlefield, gives you some ability. Or 1-drops. Number 5 is Healer's Hawk, and number 6 is Llanowar Elves. So look at those creatures. No 5-drops in sight, and no real vanilla creatures either, right? All of those creatures help either push a synergy in some way or comes into the battlefield and gives you a ton of value. I mean, Felidar Savior's upside is a 4-mana 4/5. In terms of power and toughness, and you get a lifelinking body out of the deal, and that's number 4, right? So,
man, that's just crazy.
So just put that into perspective. Basically, anything that looks somewhat vanilla, like a 3-mana 3/3 with marginal upside, probably not going to be good enough. You're going to need scrying or gaining some life, something along those lines. Maybe a +1/+1 counter. Effects like that are what you're going to be looking for. But just like a straight 3-mana 3/3, that doesn't cut it anymore. We might even need to make kind of a slight modification, because before the vanilla test, right, it's like every point of mana that you spend, you should expect a power and toughness. I feel like that's not the case anymore.
No way.
You need a little bit more, right?
Yeah,
you cannot play a 3-mana. Yeah, you can't play a 3-mana 3/3. It's got to be a 3-mana 3/3 with upside. Inspiring Paladin looked pretty solid, but even that ended up being an underperformer. It's a 3-mana with 3/3. If you attack, it's got first strike, and other things with counters also get first strike, something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
And that was still not good enough. So we have to kind of adjust what's good at common. Before, in green, a 4-mana 4/4, like a 4-mana 4/4 Trampler, yes, that was insane. Now, it's okay.
It's okay.
Right? It's
just okay.
But you need the trample on there. If you don't, it's just bad. It's actively bad. So you have to just kind of modify kind of what your baseline is. If you're spending 3 mana, you want a 3/3 with a decent amount of upside, or you want something like a 2/3 with an extra keyword on there to have it even be worthwhile.
The way I would break it down, big picture, is if I'm looking at a creature and I'm trying to figure out just from a high level standpoint, is this going to be good or not? I would say assume that it dies to a removal spell that costs 2, 3, or 4 mana. Put it through those paces and then ask yourself, what did I get out of the exchange? Right? Because the things that are standing out to me when I look at the type of creatures that do well, they are either cheaper than the removal that hit them, but still relevant enough on board to matter, or they have an ETB effect that gained me some type of value, whether it was on the board or in my hand or whatever, or they are difficult to get rid of in some way or another, mainly that they die and then something happens that replaces them or upgrades them or whatever, right? We've seen many of those type of cards where it's like, it can, if it dies, you're okay with it because something good happens. Or, and these are less common and very difficult to predict without having played the set, but they do get there on what I would describe as either just raw power, like just stats for mana, or synergy. They work well enough that you do want to play these cards. And I'm going to do the same thing that you just did, Paul. I'm going to go down the cards for Duskmourn, right? An all-timer and a very good representative of a very good set, from the modern era. And let's take a look at the pattern that we see here. These are just the commons from Duskmourn, top to bottom. So the first one is Glimmerburst, which is interesting because you could almost argue that it's a 4 mana 1/1 that draws you 2 cards at instant speed and has extra synergy. So that's kind of cool. Next one is Trapped in a Screen, so removal spell. Next one, and by the way, that's in that range that I said, the 1, 2, 3, or 4, but I would, say 2, 3, or 4 is a common thing as well. Scorching Dragonfire, 2 mana removal spell. Spineseeker Centipede. So classic ETB, right? That one even had a little bit of upside. Glassworks, 3 mana removal spell. Clockwork Percussionist. Why was this so good? It actually fulfilled 2 of the things that I just said. It's cheaper than the removal that kills it, and it's one of those annoying when it dies, you get something for it cards. It replaces itself as a card, let's say. Unable to Scream. Cheap removal. Turn Inside Out. Okay, fine. There's combat tricks in here too that don't really fit because we're talking about creatures versus removal, but there you go. We'll give it the cheap thing. Vanish from Sight. This is a perfect example of the type of removal that Paul was talking about. Yes, it's 4, but you get to surveil one as well. And that's a thing. Next is a creature, Unsettling Twins. Put it in that perspective that I just said. You spent 4 mana. What do you get? You get an ETB. And if somebody uses removal that costs 2, 3, or 4 mana to kill 1/2 of this, you're happy with that. Final Vengeance, 1 mana removal-ish. Glimmerlight. That is a card that I would call good enough on the rate/synergy spectrum. And again, what happens if somebody uses removal to kill your Glimmerlight token? You are thrilled, right? Just like if they do on your stupid Clockwork Percussionist, right? If they use a removal spell on it, you're just like, I'm never losing this game, Yeah. Monstrous Emergence. These are in order, by the way. 2 mana removal spell. Manifest Dread. Again, power plus synergy. This is a card that can turbo out the things that you need to do. Seized from Slumber. We're going to call that a 2 mana removal spell, even though it's somewhere between 2 and 5, depending. Innocuous Rat. You see the pattern here. This is one of those hard to kill cards, right? These are the top 12 or whatever I just named commons in the set. They all fit this pattern outside of the one Turn Inside Out that's like a different category, But like these are all removal spells that are either 2, 3, or 4 mana, or creatures that don't care about getting killed by removal spells that are 2, 3, or 4 mana. But what you don't see are the random 5 drops that when they die, nothing happens. This is a great way, like if I look at the bottom of the pool here, Cackling Slasher, which we just talked about. If it dies to a 2 or 3 mana removal spell nothing happens. You just lose that, right? I'm skipping a couple because they're just, they were synergy duds like Rampage and Soul Rager. But Anthropede, too bad. They already got their value out of the room, so that part doesn't really matter, and you're paying 4 mana for a 3/4 reach. The Leech that we talked about before. Bedhead Beastie, right? Yeah, it's cool that you can land cycle these, but if you ever cast one, it's a 6 mana 5/6 that dies to a 2, 3, or 4 mana removal spell, and it is an abject disaster. You see the pattern. This is a good way, I think, to frame what are the cards that I actually want to play versus what are the ones that I want to avoid these days.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we're going to touch on it obviously next week once we start getting into Ether Drift stuff. But yeah, I even feel like expensive creatures that have cycling attached to it, if the creature itself isn't particularly strong, we shouldn't be treating them like they're good cards.
No,
I know there's a lot to be said. Yeah, I know there's a lot to be said about the flexibility, but especially if it costs 2 mana to cycle, like that is not free. You are literally taking turn 2 off. One of, if not the most important turns in the game, to go cycle your card. And so that is not free. So what you want to be doing with cards like that, and like the land cyclers in this instance, is treat it as the creature. Would you be happy playing that creature? Like, is that okay? And then maybe there's a little bit of upside if you can go get the land. So all the land cyclers basically ended up missing in Duskmourn, and they all looked solid. The only one that was remotely decent was the Slavering Branch Snapper, because it's just gigantic, right? It's a 6 mana 7/6 trampler.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point, and it's another data point, backing up what we're saying. You were talking about it earlier, but what's the best approach to mana bases these days? The one thing that we like to throw out on the show is that at some point as a Magic player, you need to recognize that the standard 9/8 mana base is functionally not very good, right? It doesn't lead to consistent outcomes with regards to having both colors of mana available early in a game, for example, which would be one of the goals of a good mana base. It does not meet that requirement. Now, that's nothing to complain about because it just is what it is, but you can adjust your draft picks and your build to accommodate it. How do you do that?
Yeah, so this is kind of one thing that I try to do, especially in a draft, is number one, once you kind of lock into your 2 colors, right? In any given set, there's almost always an Evolving Wilds variant or a dual land, a land that comes into play tapped in some way and gives you the 2 colors, like a green-red deck. It could be a desert or a life gain land, any one of those types of effects. Now, I only really do this once I lock into my 2 colors, but once I lock into my 2 colors, I think it's very, very important to pick up the first copy. I just think it makes your deck run that much smoother. So once you get to picks 5, 6, 7, let's say you're in the second pack or whatever, and you have the choice between an on-color dual land and something that's a fine card, but not, the top tier removal spells, I usually take the land. Because the first copy is very important. Now, they do have diminishing returns because a lot of these lands will come into play tapped. So you don't want to be playing 4 Evolving Wilds and be like, yeah, I got perfect mana, but I'm a turn behind everybody else. But usually that first one I think is pretty important, just because I think that just massively improves your chances of just making sure that you can cast your spell. So, let's say you're like a red-white aggro deck or whatever. Let's say you're a blue-white deck in Duskmourn and you're firmly in blue-white. In pack 2, pick 5, you have the choice between a Friendly Ghost, which is just a fine, solid, playable card in your blue-white decks, or you can take your first blue-white land that comes into play tapped. I would just take the blue-white land, right? Just to make sure that I can cast my spells. But that's the important thing. You need to find kind of that right spot where you would take this card. And that's, I can't just 100% teach you exactly what you need to do, but just know that if it's a premium common, just take the premium common, right? If it's a Scorching Dragonfire, take that over the red-white land in your red-white deck. But if you're starting to get to, an area where you kind of know your lane and it's kind of a middling card, you should definitely take it. Another instance where I do like to take the lands is if I somehow just have way too many playables, and I kind of like my deck already, where I'm just like, I don't really want to cut any of these cards that I have so far. Let's say going into pack 2, you have 12 playables in your Boros aggro deck, and then pick 3, there's like a solid common, but it would be 2-drop number 8 in your deck. You're just like, you know what? I'm just going to take the land because I'm going to have to make these difficult cuts anyways. So by taking the land over the card that has a chance of getting cut, I will make sure that the overall deck is just going to be stronger because it's going to have a better mana base. One other thing that you should consider when you are drafting a 2-color deck is which color has your double mana pips. Now, I just hate double mana pip cards in general, especially if they cost 3 mana or less. I just almost never take them. But let's say you have, a Fiend Hunter variant or something, right? Which you're gonna play. Then that would lower the chances that I want to take a double red card. Let's say I'm in a red-white deck, because having a double white card and a double red card means your mana is just going to be super awkward. Which means if you make that pick, you need to make a more concerted effort into taking those lands to be able to cast your spells. So oftentimes, if it's close, then I'll just take, I won't take the double red card if it's close, and then I'll just take the white card or the single pip red card instead. So those are some of the things that you should consider when you're drafting, I think.
How often would you run a 2-color deck that had double pip mana symbols in both colors?
I think that for me, that only really happens with my uncommons and rares, right? That's where the power level of the cards are so great that it is worth you sometimes not being able to cast them, because when you do, they're that strong. So, whatever, a 3 black 7/7 flyer, let's just say, for example. And then let's say I also have a 3 white 7/7 flyer. These are not real cards, but if I have both, I'm going to play both, right? Just because on rate they're so strong. If I have a white and black Baneslayer Angel, I'm going to play both, and I'll do that. But when it comes to commons, I think they've done a good job of kind of avoiding doing this now, where they typically don't make common creatures that have double pips in them. No. But if there's a 2 green creature and a 1 white creature, and they're both commons, like, I just do not want those in my deck.
You won't run both of them.
I will try my best not to, and usually when I draft, I just won't draft them. And I'll just try to focus on one of the colors. So
do you view it as when you're drafting, is there a point at which you think this is going to be my primary color? Like, this is going to be the 9 out of the 9/8 or the 10 out of the 10/7?
Yeah, I think you get a pretty good sense, because, oftentimes when you're 2 colors, one color is going to be more open than the other in a lot of instances, right? It's just not, both colors are not going to be completely open, and you'll just notice that naturally while you're drafting, because the color that's more open will more often have cards that you table, right? Where, let's say you're green-white, and then all of a sudden you just start tabling a Monstrous Emergence or something. You're like, okay, well, green is, there's probably other green drafters, but I know that green is more open than white, and then you just end up with a couple of extra free green cards after the wheel, and then you're like, okay, well, this color will likely be my more primary color. Alternatively, you just have a bomb that just has heavy color requirements in one color, then you should really focus on having a bunch of sources. Let's say you open a Kogla, right? 3 green 7/6. Well, you better hope that you can have something like a 10/7 mana base to be able to support that Kogla, because if you cast it, it's a bomb, but you need to make the necessary mana adjustments to be able to fit that into your deck. And that's something that you always need to consider when you draft your decks. 2-color decks and 3-color decks. And I can go on a completely different tangent with 3-color stuff, just because I always make a joke about this when I see people just irresponsibly playing their cards. I just say that they all have no respect for the game.
Totally.
Because when I see a 1 mana white creature, a 1 mana black creature, and then like a double blue spell, I'm just like, dude, what are you doing?
Totally.
I have a podcast I can recommend you to so you can not do this again, because that's just no respect for the game. And I just I'll even see it in, I have a Discord channel, and I'll see people posting these 3-color decks, and I'm like, you really need to just don't go in with the mindset of trying to figure out a 3-color deck. Stick to the 2 colors. You'll win way more, I promise.
And that, by the way,
just
bears
the
itself
baseline.
out effectively every time. If you look at the color breakdowns on 17 lands, like it is
Yeah.
very difficult to pull off. Even splashes are almost always detrimental. They feel like they're not, but
Yeah, it almost in almost all instances, unless there's like a prophetic prism in the format where there's like a really solid artifact that lets you play other colors, you only really can pull this off comfortably if you're a base green deck and whatever the common green mana fixer that you have is also good. Right? You don't want just 2 green search your library for a land and then just have that be your fixer. But if it's premium, like Spineseeker Centipede, for example, right? That is a format where you could have gone 3 colors with the base green deck because it's one of the best commons in the entire set, and it gets you the land. In that instance, it's fine, but that's pretty rare. That doesn't happen all that often. So just more often than not, draft the 2-color deck. Don't look to splash, and stop taking cards in that splash color that looks to be slightly stronger. Just stick to your colors once you know what your lane is going to be. Don't go, oh, I'm black green and I see a scorching dragonfire, or I can take a solid bear in my colors. A lot of people just take the scorching dragonfire and they go, you know what, I'm going to figure it out. Don't. Stick to your lane. I promise you, you will win more games.
Yeah, I think that, watching you and Luis draft, and, I don't do draft videos anymore, but I draft similarly. I think that that's one of the biggest places that most people could get edge at this point is by being more conservative with their mana base. That I feel that people are far, far too willing to splash for mediocre upgrades. They're far too willing to take, a double white spell and a 1 and a double green and just put them in the same deck and hope it all works out with no fixing or minimal fixing. I think they're far too willing to take their 4th mediocre playable common that's probably not going to make the cut over a dual land in their colors. You should be skewing things towards, I want to be able to consistently cast my spells every single game if I can, and recognize that in a world where there's so many playables, this reminds me of Cube, right? When you first start Cube drafting and you see people like Luis, like if you watch Luis on his YouTube and he opens up a mediocre Cube pack, you'll be like, I'm just going to take Polluted Delta.
Right.
Even though you can see good cards in there's some stuff, but it's nothing like punchy, nothing like really, really strong. He's like, I'll just take the Delta. Yep. Right. And if you haven't drafted Cube, you're going to pull your hair out. You're going to go, what? Like, what are you doing? Wasting a pick on some stupid fetch land, you need to be taking cards. And the truth is you don't, because every single card in Cube is amazing. Also, as it turns out, fetch lands are really, really good in Cube for a variety of reasons, not related to mana fixing, but I'll digress on that. But it's interesting because the whole reasoning is you have extra picks to spend because you're not going to be short playables in Cube. Limited isn't to that level now, like regular set limited. It's not that far though. Like, we showed you the worst creatures in the set are at common are like fine. Like if you play one, you're not going to lose the draft because you put a Cackling Slasher in your deck. It's not a happy occasion, but it's your 23rd card, right? Yep. And that's in a situation where something went very, very wrong in the draft. Like you got way off track if that's a card that ends up being in your deck. But you know what it does? It has stats. It attacks, it blocks. Sometimes it's bigger. It has death. Like it does things, right? Yeah. And, so if you want to hedge your bets a little bit and pick a dual land over even an okay playable, you're probably going to end up ahead on that in the end of it. Talk about mana curve. We just talked about, color-wise wanting to be conservative. How big of a consideration is mana curve, going into a blind set? I
think it's probably one of the most important things.
It's maybe the most.
It probably, yeah. It definitely is. And so early on, you can be a little bit more flexible. Like maybe you can take one big thing, but as the draft progresses, knowing when you take that big thing over the decent cheap thing, you can't do that many times over again, because that's how you end up with a train wreck, right? Let's say every time you had the chance of taking a good 4-mana creature and a good 2-mana creature, and you took the 4-mana creature, then you end up with kind of a disaster of a deck that ends up too clunky. But guess what happens the other way? You just take the good 2-mana creature every single time. It's still not going to be a disaster. Your deck will still be good and still will be solid. So oftentimes for me, if things are close, I typically lean towards the cheaper card. But I mean, you have to balance that, because if the 4-mana card is obviously better, like, you're going to take it. Mm-hmm. But for example, if I have 3 Felidar Sovereigns, or what a Felidar, whatever, Felidar Sovereigns.
Is it Savior? Sovereign?
Savior? Yeah, Sovereign, I think, is the 4/6 drop. Yeah. But if you have 3 of those, then going into pack 3, you have the choice between a Healer's Hawk and the 4th Sovereign. I know the Healer's Hawk might just be better anyways, but let's say you have that choice, just take the Healer's Hawk, right? And you have to make those decisions. And that's what makes draft so beautiful, because you always are constantly building a new deck, and you are literally constructing your deck, and every pick is extremely important, and you have to make concessions while you're drafting. You have to make concessions to your mana base. You also have to make concessions to your mana curve, and then you also have to make concessions to even creature density, right? Let's say you're playing a red-white deck. A red-white deck wants 15 creatures, right? You want a high amount of creatures because you want to just usually curve out and beat people down. And in that instance, let's say you have a bunch of premium removal spells already going into pack 3. Yeah, sometimes you just got to take kind of the weird 2-mana 2/2 over another Banishing Light, because your game plan is to curve out and beat people. If you play against a blue-black control deck and your hand is just a bunch of Banishing Lights and Luminous Rebukes, that's not the strategy for your archetype. So you also have to play to what your color combination is looking to do and make sacrifices there as well. Obviously, early on, I'm taking all the Banishing Lights I see. But after a certain amount, it's really important to make sure that you also make the responsible picks with regards to your creatures and your mana curve as well.
Yeah, the curve to me seems to rule the day. If you take all of the creatures in a set and make them on a spectrum of playable to less playable, let's say, rather than unplayable or horrendously bad, you just take that off the table, then what's the differentiator? Right? And the differentiator becomes, well, how much mana did you spend? And that goes back to our discussion earlier about, if you play if a 1-mana card is playable, there's no scenario where your opponent can get ahead on you. The best case for them is to use a 1-mana removal spell. Reverse of that's true. If it's a 5-mana creature and it doesn't do anything when it ETBs, I'm not going to say literally no, because there are removal spells that cost 5 or 6 mana, but of the stuff that people play draft in and draft out, there's no removal spells that don't leave them in a mana, bonus over what you've done. So what matters? Curve. Period. That's what matters. And then what I see big picture is, if you force the curves down, which I believe is what's happened, then there's an extra pressure on your mana base, right? To kind of tie the last 2 big points together. If your mana sucks, if you have too many tap lands, if your mana is too greedy, and you're trying to do a low curve deck where one of the big benefits is like double spelling on an early turn or curving out, you can't have it all. You have to be conservative and responsible with the way that your mana base is set up in relation to your curve. This is extremely important. And if you watch really good players, watch Paul play, I guarantee you will be surprised. He's much less greedy than you are. I mean, seriously, right? Like, just your average player, if you watch Paul play, Paul's going to say, I'm not going to take this really good 1 double white spell because it doesn't fit my mana. And even though I would totally play that card in my deck if it was, 2 and a white, it's not. So instead, I'm going to take this other mediocre card. And I see people, watch your stream and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe you passed that. And it's like, this is why he's playing a low curve deck. He cannot have bad mana. You can't have low curve that needs to curve out and then also not be able to cast your spells. That is a complete disaster, because when you play low curve cards off curve, they're bad. Like, now they're just not keeping up with what, your opponent's doing.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen countless decks when we've covered limited pro tours where we look at a person's draft and their deck doesn't look particularly powerful. Let's say in the hands of somebody like a Marcio or a Seth Manfield.
Yep.
But they just draft a deck with a good mana curve and a decent number of combat tricks. And how many times do they 3-0? All the time, it seems, right?
Time.
And then we look at this sweet deck where everything comes together. They have all these bombs, but they're all kind of expensive. And we're just like, man, if they just survive to the late game, they're going to be unbeatable. And they end up going 1-2 in the draft, right? Just because they just get run over by the Boros beatdown player that went 2-drop, 3-drop, combat trick, save my guy, plus play another creature, and all of a sudden you're dead.
Yeah, I just think it's a fundamentally better approach. It doesn't have to be aggressive, but it does have to be fast. That's the bottom line. Let's zoom out a little bit. I'm putting you back in the seat of, hey, there's this set coming out next month and you got a PT or whatever. Heuristically speaking, what color pairs are you thinking are probably going to work? And what color pairs are you thinking, I'll probably avoid that one until I get some real evidence that, there's something worth going for there?
Yeah, so there is a surefire color combination that will almost never be the worst color combination in any set.
Is it red-white?
It's red-white.
It's red-white.
It's red-white, 100%.
It's always red-white, Paul.
It is always red-white. And I think that's going to be the case in Ether Drift as well. But I just think that combination, it only does one thing. It plays a bunch of creatures and it wants to curve out. It is the premier aggressive strategy almost always. And it's got that nice mixture of good cheap creatures on curve. You're always going to have cheap combat tricks, and it's still going to have some enough removal to break through. So red-white is always just, if you have a good curve with red-white, you will almost always have a chance, unless the format is just really weird and it's like kind of slow and there's a lot of good comeback mechanics. I think red-white is the one that's proven to be a top 3 archetype in basically every set that comes out.
Okay, so red-white's one that you'll have your eyes on, particularly early in a set before people figure out the more complicated ones, and you can just curve out and beat them down. What are some others that you would, that have, at least in the last, run of sets that you've said like, nah, those are usually good. Like, is red-black on there?
Oh, as far as what will be good?
Yeah, just ones that you would assume until proven otherwise would be good.
Yeah, I generally kind of would lean towards the proactive color combinations because your blue, it's very hit or miss.
Very variable.
Right? It's like if there is no awesome Mana War type card or something like that at common, blue often ends up being a little bit underwhelming, and it's almost always a support color. So I try to I just feel like it can be good, but there are often times where that misses. So I kind of would shy away from that in the beginning. And I think red-white is fine. Red-black usually has, you can still be aggressive. You're going to have a ton of removal, which not always is the correct thing, of course, but you can still be aggressive. And, oftentimes there's some sacrifice stuff to go with that. And then green has also sometimes been hit or miss as well. I think they've been doing a much better job recently with powering up green, foundation withstanding. Red green still ended up being quite good because of Llanowar Elves, but green was obviously great in Duskmourn, right? With the Spineseeker Centipede. So I feel like they've made those adjustments to green to have green be also pretty solid. So red green, red white, those color combinations end up pretty good. Red, I guess, just because it's one of the most aggressive colors, that ends up being pretty good. Blue red is a color combination I would avoid, especially if it's leaning into the spells thing. I feel like they haven't quite figured that out yet. If blue-red is maybe an artifact theme or something else, it could be good. But going in, blue-red is always a color combination where I look at all the cards and I go, wow, that looks pretty cool. And then it ends up being the worst archetype. And that's been the case pretty consistently over the last year. Yeah. So that's probably something where that's probably a prove-it color combination too. Yeah. I mean, going in, I'm going to draft everything, right? Because I just want to explore all of that myself. Yeah. But let's say in the dark, I am doing a draft for $1,000.
Yes.
And I've never seen the set before.
And you get to pick your colors.
Right. I will probably not go in trying to be blue-red.
Agreed. And also blue-green has to be on that list. Black-green has to be on that list, right? These are color pairs that they've had a very difficult time making work consistently. They've picked some themes that have worked or just powered it up, but there's been times where we're kind of left shrugging, going, what is this even supposed to be? Or it just missed. Right. I love the way you framed that when I first asked you, when you said, the more proactive, assertive color pairs, the colors and color pairs that are looking to actually put forth their game plan, and it's a relatively straightforward one, are generally the place to start, especially, when curving out and, low curve and stuff like that is ruling the day. None of these, of course, I trust our listener base to understand the nuance here, but, just to be clear, these are, every single set is its own unique thing.
Right.
And so, these are assumptions that have proven themselves out, let's say over the last couple of years, and we would assume would have some merit going forward. But you can find counter examples of everything that we've said here, right?
No, absolutely.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have a podcast, and drafting would suck if you just knew
this
ahead
is like
of time.
This is like a week one primer going in blind. What are things that might give you a better chance of winning?
Right.
And then so like if you have a close pick, you're like, ooh, this is a red-white card. Maybe I'll do this.
Yeah. And I mean,
but then you'll find out, of course, what actually is good.
Right. Because to me, this isn't about actionable information in terms of I'm going to actually just take this ball and run with it. This is a taking stock of where we're at from a theory standpoint on limited today. What does limited look like now? We love to talk about how it was and contrast that. And I think it has some applicable value, and it's also fun to talk about. But if we just left the past behind us and said, where are things today? How do I approach these forms? Because you have that. Like, I watch you draft. I'll watch you do the early access event if you're doing it. And, I know that you are putting these things out into play. Like, you are saying, I'm going to start off by being assertive. You may not say those words, but I can watch you draft and see you do it. Mm-hmm. And I can see you valuing your mana curve and understanding all of these things. And I wanted to get that into something more cohesive for our listener base to kind of go, here's a check-in. Maybe you've been assuming things that we don't anymore. Right? Maybe you as a listener have been saying, oh, well, this is how I approach things because I heard it on the show or because this makes sense to me. Well, it may be time for you to get fully caught up on where things are at now from an assumption standpoint, from where we start when a set comes out. Of course, once the set comes out, everything starts to get adjusted. All the knobs to turn, everything's getting turned to do that. One last thing that I wanted to hit you up with was when you are drafting, we touched on this a little bit before, but how much are you considering making playables?
I don't think it's as important as it used to be, where we talk about a long time ago, you would have they just made a bunch of unplayable commons back in the day. And now I just feel like that's not necessarily the case anymore. So oftentimes, like you said, there's just often filler level cards that you can make your deck. So, and I remember you also touched on this with Circovitz, where it's actually very important. It's more important to stay open and identify your colors. And then if you identify the correct lane and make the pivot when you need to, you will improve your win rate. It's just that, that's just how you should be drafting. So that's kind of my approach as well. I try to keep things open. And if I see a pretty clear signal that I do need to make the pivot, I'm not super worried unless it's a really late pivot. But let's say I just take a bunch of red and green cards, and then you see a fourth pick Dreadwing Scavenger, right? Just take the Dreadwing Scavenger, right? And then, if you're going to get that fourth pick, the upside is just so high. If you get the makings of a good Dimir control deck, I don't usually worry too much that I'm going to have enough playables, because if you can identify the lane and make that pivot, you will often table cards. If you're in the wrong lane, that's when you struggle for playables, right? If you're the green-white drafter and the person to your right's passing to you is in green-white, that's when it's really hard because you end up with 7 playables after every pack, right? Because they're taking all the cards in pack 1 and pack 3. You're getting some picks in pack 2, but then you're just not tabling anything because there's just too many green and white drafters at the table, something along those lines. So I just think, and obviously reading signals is really, really difficult, right? You can't just go in blind and know. But after you draft a bunch, you start seeing cards that you know have no business being in there. And then that's when you can kind of make that decision to pivot. But yeah, I'm never overly concerned about my playables. And like I said, if I have the choice between mediocre common, but it's something that's my 20th to 23rd card that'll go into my deck, and a blossoming sands or something, right? Just a dual land that's good, that's on color, I will more often take the dual land. Now, with the exception, if I go into pack 3, like once you're in pack 3, you already have a good sense for what your deck's going to look like, right? Let's say you did make a hard pivot, right? But after pack 2, you have 13 cards in your deck. Then, yes, I am worried. And in those instances, do not take the land. Take the playable card to make sure that you still have that cohesive strategy, which I've had to do that in the past as well, where I thought, well, you know what? I thought I sent good signals. Pack 2 was going to be good for me. And what if, for whatever reason, the person that I passed to probably opened some bomb, didn't move off of those colors, and I got nothing in pack 2. Then you have to make some concessions and go, you know what? I'll take the slightly worse mana base here just because I absolutely need that 20th playable in my deck.
That's right. It's interesting because like if I watch one of your videos or watch your videos in general, and I don't hear you talking about that very often. I don't hear you saying, "Oh, we're not going to make playables."
Right.
It's just
that's
not
a disaster
scenario.
scenario.
Yeah, that's where something went really, really weird. You know, because if you just have a pile of cards in roughly 2 colors, you probably have enough to make a deck that, isn't deficient in any of the main things. Like you have enough creatures or whatever, you have stuff that you can cast. You may not be happy with it. I mean, they are going to be worse than the stuff that you may be going against or that you'd prefer to play. But there is such a huge chasm between, I'm a little sad I had to play a mediocre, a subpar, a D level creature or 2. And, I just don't have any cards, right? Like I have to just put extra, I'm playing 20 lands because like I just missed, that kind of thing. Right. That's the difference between, again, the definition of playable here is variable because we will often say, oh, well, Cackling Slasher is unplayable. And, that's just how we talk in Magic, but it's not a literal case. Like again, not to make this about stupid Cackling Slasher. I've never actually played one, but
this is the most anybody's ever talked about Cackling Slasher.
It's interesting because, it really does show like what we're talking about here. Like after all the things I've said, I don't believe I've ever actually put one in my deck because you have so many playables, you don't need to ever, right? It's like, it just doesn't come up anymore. And I think that that's a good chance to say, okay, how can I use that to my advantage? And the 2 main ways that come up, I think, are 1, what you said about the lands. Like I can afford to take a dual land to make my mana better over a playable because I'm going to get there anyway. And the other one is speculation. If it's early enough in the draft and it's a mediocre common in your 2 colors or a really top tier card like the Scavenger that you mentioned, I will gamble. I am willing to throw away 3 picks. Like that's okay with me. If I get myself in a better situation, in a more open situation, I'm good. Like that's fine by me because again, I don't feel that extreme pressure that I have to just grab onto 2 colors and hang on for the ride. I don't feel that way when I'm drafting. I feel that I've got, not as much in cube where I can kind of just go, I can do whatever I want and, hard pivot in pack 2. Okay, maybe not, right? But it is more open than grab on for the ride and just hope that it all works out.
Yeah, definitely.
Good stuff, Paul. This is fun. We haven't got to do a level up episode since you've been back, and we hadn't done one in a little while with Luis either. So that was fun. Hopefully useful for the audience as well. Again, we always aim to have these things be insightful and help you actually draft, right? So these are big picture concepts that are very modern. These are the ways that we draft now, and hopefully they help get you up to speed. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR. And Paul is Houmph pretty much everywhere. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. I want to say thank you to each and every person who supports us on Patreon, as well as Ultimate Guard for supporting the show. Make sure you check out Paul's YouTube channel, link in the description for that, for daily draft content, especially as we start to move towards Ether Drift, where once they give him control, he will be putting up Ether Drift content as well. That is going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll see you next time. Paul, I've got a story for you.
Okay, hit me up.
It's about one of the best feelings in the world, but it's about contrast. So I was working on a watch yesterday.
Okay.
And I've been sick this week. You can probably tell I'm a little stuffed up still, but started feeling better yesterday. And I was like, all right, let's do some filming. I got some filming I need to do. And one of the things about working on watches while also filming is that you have to work around the cameras. And normally when you work on a watch, you're really close to it. You wear a loop and you get your eye just a couple of inches away from where you're working. And the desk will traditionally be elevated up and it'll have cutouts for your arms so that you don't have to hunch over. So you can work at eye level. But I don't have one of those desks. And my desk does go up and down though, so I can raise it up at least. But I have all these cameras and cables and iPads and all these things floating around. So the way that I work on it's a lot different than what a regular watch repair person would do. And one of the things that I have to do is take very small parts and show them on a microscope and then transfer them back to the area where I'm actually working on them. And yesterday I dropped one.
Ooh.
This happens sometimes. This is kind of part of the deal.
Right.
But this was a particularly annoying one because it was made of two different materials. One of them is brass and the other one is a ruby jewel. It's a synthetic ruby that they use as kind of a bearing surface inside the watch. It's a really cool red color. But the part's tiny, by human standards. By watchmaking standards, it's kind of medium. There's actually smaller parts than this. But as I went to move it back over, it disappeared. So, and I spent about an hour and a half looking for it.
Oh, God.
Now, I have a thing that I'll use, which is I took a metal ruler and I put rare earth magnets on it, those really strong magnets.
Yeah.
The problem is that brass is non-ferrous. Like it doesn't go to magnets. So right. I couldn't use that. What you can do is you can use either a very strong light, which is what I did. I used one of my old studio type lights. So it's just a ton of light to try to look. Or you can also, for these rubies, you can use a UV light and it makes them glow. They glow like kind of a bright red color, but it's really small. So it's not that great. So I looked for an hour and a half and I couldn't find it.
Okay.
I had to go into the office where, I started a website that's in relation to the watch channel where we, sell watch toolkits. And we have an office. And so I went in there to do some work for that. And I was frustrated, of course, because I couldn't find the part. And I had to stop my video and I had to stop the whole thing. And now I'm going to have to look around on eBay and do the whole thing. But one of the benefits of filming, so I told you the bad part. The good part is that I am filming.
Yeah.
So sometimes I can go back and look at what I filmed and see if the part maybe flew a certain direction or went somewhere that I couldn't see.
Instant replay.
I got instant replay, but with tiny parts moving fast, they don't show up on camera.
It's pretty hard.
It's pretty bad. But I did actually at least start to get myself aimed in a direction based on what I saw. So I went and had dinner and when I came home that night, I'm like, all right, let's get back in there. So I'm down on the ground. I'm moving furniture. I got flashlights. I got UV lights. No magnet for this one. And I went for about 40 more minutes, nothing. And these parts are so small, by the way, that they can fall into the crease of your pants or get caught on your skin. I mean, they don't, you can't feel them. And I was laying on the ground and I was just like, okay, I'm probably not going to find this thing.
Right.
And I turned over and something caught my eye. on the ground. And I was like that looks very round, which is what I'm looking for.
Right.
And I got up close, and sure enough, I had dislodged it by moving something, and it had landed kind of right next to me on the ground.
So you're just like in your moment of defeat.
Totally.
You just turn your head and then it's just there.
Totally. Just
That's
on
like
the verge of
moment,
a mental
right?
breakdown. And now
searching for a piece for 2 hours.
I have a pretty strong theory going that maybe God exists. Like it might have been like
there's a lot of people that would agree with you.
So. Yeah. And I was kind of skeptical up until last night.
Yeah.
But after having found this part, I'm much more open to the idea of a benevolent, all-knowing being that placed that jewel right next to me, even though I had looked in that spot like 7 times or whatever. So let's just say if you want to start working on watches, you may be prepared for a religious experience at some point.
Oh, God. Yeah, that would tilt me so hard. Just not being able, just losing something that small that's just so important to actually completing the thing that you were on.
It's unbelievably
I get mad when I'm missing a puzzle piece. When I'm doing a puzzle with the kids, but
it's like that.
It's that like times 10.
Times 10. It's so small. I'll send you a picture of it. But
all right.
Yeah. Anyway, God.
Good that you found it, though.
Apparently
Good
exists.
that you found it.
Yeah.
There you go.